Now let me ask you something that might make you a little uncomfortable. But growth never happens in comfort zones, does it? Have you ever wondered why, despite decades of global politics, shifting alliances, and powerful economic transformations, America still seems to openly support Pakistan against India? What we often see on the surface is not always what lies beneath. In the complex world of international relations, perception plays a massive role, sometimes even more than reality. When we talk about America's apparent support for Pakistan over India, the first thing we need to understand is that what is perceived by the public, especially through the media and political statements, is often a constructed narrative, not the whole truth. This perception that America sides with Pakistan didn't just appear out of nowhere. It's the result of decades of strategic communication, selective partnerships, and a legacy of Cold War-era alliances that have never fully dissolved. Pakistan, from the early 1950s, positioned itself as a critical ally to the United States, especially in its rivalry with the Soviet Union. It provided military bases, intelligence cooperation, and a geographically vital location, bordering Iran, Afghanistan, China, and India. That early alliance laid the foundation for a long-term perception of Pakistan as an indispensable partner. Meanwhile, India, though democratic and vast in potential, pursued a non-aligned foreign policy during the Cold War, leaning closer to the Soviet Union at many critical junctures. That choice shaped how Western powers perceived India for decades. Despite India's size, growing economic power, and strategic potential, it didn't fit neatly into the binary logic of Cold War alliances. This set the tone for a narrative that cast India as an unpredictable player, while Pakistan was portrayed as a willing, consistent ally, regardless of the complexities underneath. Perception, however, is not just formed by history. It is actively managed in the present. Public diplomacy and international lobbying all shape how countries are viewed on the world stage. Pakistan has invested heavily in controlling how it is perceived, especially in Washington, D.C. Through think tanks, defense collaborations, and diaspora lobbying groups, it has succeeded in keeping its image relevant and strategically important. On the other hand, India's growing presence in global technology and trade has certainly improved its image, but its assertiveness in foreign policy and domestic controversies have sometimes clashed with Western expectations, causing hesitations in full-throated support. Another layer to this perception problem is the way conflict is framed. In most Western discourse, especially media, Pakistan is often painted as the victim of terrorism, of instability, of poor governance, and America steps in as a supporter to maintain stability. India, in contrast, is sometimes viewed as the bigger power, and thus any assertive action taken by India is scrutinized more critically. This creates a perception imbalance. Even when India responds to provocations, the narrative often shifts toward escalation, not resolution. The military aspect cannot be ignored either. Pakistan has remained one of the top recipients of American military aid and training. The justification is often rooted in counter-terrorism cooperation, but the underlying message it sends is one of alignment. This military partnership gives the perception that America trusts Pakistan with its strategic interests, even when those very interests occasionally conflict with India's. Then, there's the issue of narrative control within the American domestic space. The average American citizen or policymaker does not have deep knowledge of South Asian geopolitics. What they see or hear is often simplified and filtered. In that filter, Pakistan comes off as a country America has worked with for decades, while India is a rising power with its own agenda. That framing affects not only how decisions are made in Washington, but also how the public interprets those decisions. Perception also hinges on consistency. Pakistan, for all its internal chaos, has maintained a remarkably consistent external narrative, strategic, necessary, and cooperative with the West. India, with its rapid growth and shifting political stance, is still finding its voice on the global stage, and that makes it harder to control how it is perceived. When countries don't own their narrative, others define it for them. America's strategic relationship with Pakistan is not an emotional choice. It is rooted in cold, calculated geopolitical interests. When we talk about why the United States appears to openly support Pakistan against India, it's essential to understand the strategic value that Pakistan has offered the U.S. over the past several decades. It's not about loyalty or moral alignment. It's about what Pakistan represents in terms of geography, military access, and regional influence, especially in zones of American interest like the Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia. Pakistan's geographical location is one of its most powerful strategic assets. It borders Afghanistan, China, Iran, and India. Afghanistan made a large percentage of Pakistan's geographic pride. It borders far eastern South Asia. The gulf by the border is too big to be mistaken. For the United States, particularly during the Cold War and in the post-9/11 era, Pakistan was seen as a gateway, both literally and politically, into volatile and significant regions. During the war in Afghanistan, the U.S. relied heavily on Pakistani supply routes, intelligence sharing, and military cooperation. The country served as a logistical and operational base that enabled America to maintain its military presence in the region. No matter how complicated the relationship got, that utility made Pakistan difficult to ignore or sideline. Beyond geography, Pakistan has served as a major non-NATO ally to the United States. This designation gave it access to U.S. military training, equipment, and funding. In return, the U.S. maintained a foothold in a nuclear-armed, Muslim-majority country that had influence over various Islamist militant networks operating in the region. That influence, whether perceived or real, gave Pakistan leverage. Even when its actions contradicted U.S. interests, such as harboring elements linked to terrorism, the U.S. often continued the partnership under the logic of strategic necessity. In this dynamic, Pakistan positioned itself not just as an ally, but as a gatekeeper to stability or chaos in the region. At the same time, the American defense industry has found Pakistan to be a consistent customer for arms, equipment, and training. These sales are not just financial transactions. They're instruments of long-term influence. Every weapon sold, every system installed, creates a form of dependency, a link between the two nations that goes deeper than diplomacy. In contrast, India's defense strategy has traditionally been more diverse and independent, sourcing equipment from Russia, Israel, France, and more recently, developing its own indigenous defense capabilities. That independence, while admirable, reduces leverage for countries like the U.S., which prefer strategic partners that rely on them for critical systems. Pakistan's strategic narrative is also centered on the idea that it is the frontline state in the fight against terrorism. This has been repeated in American political and military circles for years. Whether or not this claim holds up to close scrutiny, the narrative is stuck. It has allowed Pakistan to secure billions in aid and military support from successive American administrations. The logic has always been, if Pakistan is abandoned, it might collapse or turn hostile, and the consequences would be too dangerous to risk. This narrative of strategic indispensability has proven remarkably resilient. Moreover, Pakistan plays a balancing role in the broader chessboard involving China. While China and Pakistan are close allies, the U.S. often tries to maintain lines of communication and influence with Pakistan as a way of counterbalancing China's dominance in the region. It's not about eliminating China's influence. It's about keeping a seat at the table. If the U.S. were to push Pakistan entirely into China's corner, it would lose whatever strategic leverage remains. India, by contrast, is increasingly seen as a counterweight to China, but it operates on its own terms. That autonomy, while respected, doesn't serve American control. It serves Indian interest. The U.S. often chooses allies based not on democratic values or moral consistency, but on who can deliver results aligned with its short and medium-term strategic goals. Pakistan, with its intelligence networks, military access, and regional entanglements, has long been able to offer just enough to keep American interests tied to it. Even when that relationship turns sour or tense, the strategic utility keeps the ties from breaking completely. India's foreign policy has historically been marked by a strong sense of independence, shaped by its colonial past and its vision of strategic autonomy. Unlike many countries that aligned clearly with one bloc during the Cold War, India carved out a different path through the non-aligned movement. This decision, while rooted in principle and long-term thinking, had consequences for how global powers, especially the United States, perceived and engaged with India. In a world divided by ideological lines, India's refusal to fully commit to either the US or the Soviet Union meant it was often treated with suspicion or kept at arm's length. During the Cold War, India leaned closer to the Soviet Union, especially for military and technological support. This was not because of ideological alignment, but because the Soviet Union was willing to provide critical infrastructure, arms, and political backing during moments of crisis, including conflicts with Pakistan. This pragmatic relationship helped India develop its defense capabilities, but it also placed India outside the core strategic framework of the West. For the United States, which was then deeply involved in countering Soviet influence globally, India appeared to be on the wrong side of the power equation, or at best, an unreliable partner. This legacy continued to shape perceptions even after the Cold War ended. India's independent posture, including its refusal to sign certain US-led treaties or join specific Western-led initiatives, created friction with American foreign policy expectations. In contrast, Pakistan, though far from a model of stability or democracy, was seen as more pliable and willing to align with U.S. goals, particularly in the context of the Middle East and South Asia. That alignment, even if inconsistent or problematic, was interpreted as cooperation, while India's independence was sometimes misread as defiance. India's decision-making process has always been deeply rooted in its own national interest, and this sometimes puts it at odds with American expectations. Whether it's maintaining trade with sanctioned countries like Iran or buying defense equipment from Russia, India chooses partners based on strategic need, not external pressure. While this earns respect in some quarters, it also creates diplomatic tensions. Washington, which often expects alignment from its partners, finds India's refusal to toe the line frustrating, particularly in sensitive global matters like energy policy, sanctions, or regional military cooperation. Moreover, India's approach to global issues like climate change, intellectual property rights, and international trade reflects a developing country's priorities, which often conflict with Western agendas. India argues for equity, fairness, and differentiated responsibility, principles that challenge the established power dynamics in institutions dominated by the West. These disagreements, though rooted in logic and fairness, contribute to the perception that India is a difficult partner on the global stage. In the realm of defense, India's insistence on diversifying its arms imports and developing indigenous capabilities has also impacted its relationship with the U.S. While recent years have seen increasing cooperation, such as foundational defense agreements and joint military exercises, India remains cautious. It does not want to fall into dependency on any single power, especially not one that might impose conditions or use leverage in times of diplomatic disagreement. This strategic autonomy, while beneficial for India's long-term sovereignty, reduces America's ability to influence Indian policy through traditional tools like military aid or diplomatic pressure. There's also a psychological aspect to consider. India sees itself as a civilizational power with its own worldview, not just another country fitting into Western design structures. This sense of self often translates into resistance toward adopting foreign policy lines dictated by others. While this confidence is necessary and admirable, it does not always align with the transactional, interest-based diplomacy practiced by the U.S., where alignment is often rewarded and resistance penalized. India's growing partnership with countries like Russia and Iran, as well as its active role in BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, also sends signals that India intends to remain a multipolar actor rather than a subordinate ally. This broad-based engagement strategy can make India appear unpredictable to those used to binary global alliances. In such an environment, countries like Pakistan which are willing to play by the rules of a single powerful patron, are often perceived as easier to manage and more predictable. The defense economy plays a critical role in shaping international relationships, and when it comes to the dynamics between the United States, Pakistan, and India, the arms trade is not just a matter of commerce. It is a strategic tool of influence. The flow of military aid, weapons systems, and defense technology creates long-term dependencies and partnerships that go far beyond the battlefield. For decades, the United States has maintained a defense-based relationship with Pakistan that has deeply influenced how both countries operate diplomatically and strategically. Pakistan has been a consistent recipient of U.S. military aid since the 1950s. This aid has included everything from fighter jets and attack helicopters to training programs and counterinsurgency support. The reasoning behind this support has shifted over time, from Cold War containment strategies to post-9/11 counterterrorism operations. But the result has remained largely the same. Pakistan has been kept within the orbit of U.S. strategic influence through a steady pipeline of defense cooperation. These relationships are built on contracts, logistics, maintenance, and interoperability, all of which create a durable bond between military establishments. Military assistance is not only about capability, it's about access and leverage. When the U.S. provides weapons systems, it gains insight into how those systems are used, who is being trained, and how decisions are made within the recipient country's military. This creates a kind of strategic intimacy that is difficult to replicate through diplomatic channels alone. In the case of Pakistan, this military support has often allowed Washington to maintain a presence or exert influence in moments of regional tension, even when broader political relations were strained. In contrast, India has traditionally maintained a diversified defense procurement policy. While the U.S.-India defense relationship has improved significantly in recent years, with high-value deals such as Apache helicopters, C-17 transport aircraft, and surveillance drones, India still sources much of its military hardware from Russia, France, and indigenous development programs. This diversity in sourcing limits the leverage that any single country, including the U.S., can exert over India through military dependencies. While this protects India's strategic autonomy, it also means that the defense relationship with the U.S. is more transactional and less entrenched than it is with countries like Pakistan. The defense economy is not just about buying and selling weapons. It also includes training programs, joint exercises, intelligence sharing, and technology transfers. Pakistan has participated in countless U.S.-led training initiatives and joint operations, especially in the context of counterterrorism. These initiatives create a level of operational familiarity between the two countries that builds trust among military leadership, even when political leadership may be at odds. The result is a perception, particularly within American defense circles, that Pakistan is a known quantity, a partner with whom practical cooperation is possible, even if the broader relationship is complex. Another factor is the financial ecosystem of the defense industry itself. Large American defense contractors have a vested interest in maintaining long-term clients. Pakistan, through consistent engagement in military needs, has become part of this economic structure. Defense companies lobby to keep such relationships alive, especially when they involve large-scale contracts or recurring maintenance programs. These corporate interests, while not the sole driver of foreign policy, exert real influence on congressional and administrative decision-making. India's approach to indigenization and self-reliance in defense further complicates the picture. While it is increasingly open to joint ventures and technology sharing, India remains cautious about becoming too reliant on any one supplier. The U.S., which often ties its high-end military exports to conditions related to use, end-user monitoring, and geopolitical alignment, finds it more difficult to engage with India on its own terms. This creates friction in negotiations and can delay or limit the scope of defense cooperation. Meanwhile, Pakistan continues to frame its military needs in terms that align with U.S. strategic interests, whether it's counterterrorism, regional stability, or even humanitarian missions. By presenting itself as a frontline state with ongoing security challenges, it keeps the defense aid pipeline active. This reinforces its role as a strategic partner in the eyes of American policymakers who view military cooperation as a key metric of alliance strength. Media plays an essential role in shaping public perception and influencing policy, especially when it comes to international relations. In the context of the United States' approach toward Pakistan and India, media narratives and controlled optics have had a powerful impact on how these countries are perceived, not only by the American public, but also by policymakers and global institutions. The way stories are framed, the frequency with which certain events are reported, and the tone used in coverage all contribute to a larger narrative architecture that can either elevate or diminish a country's standing. Over the years, Pakistan has skillfully positioned itself in Western media as a nation constantly on the edge, struggling with terrorism, political instability, and economic hardship, but also portrayed as a necessary ally in maintaining regional balance. This portrayal often generates sympathy, concern, and most importantly, justification for continued engagement. Media coverage, whether intentional or unintentional, tends to cast Pakistan as a state that may be flawed but is strategically vital. Headlines about aid packages, peace talks, or cooperation in counterterrorism reinforce the image of Pakistan as a nation that, despite its problems, remains a valuable player in America's foreign policy toolkit. On the other hand, India, despite being the world's largest democracy and a growing economic power, often finds its image subjected to critical scrutiny, especially when domestic political developments do not align with Western liberal expectations. Issues like religious tensions, press freedom, or internal protests receive disproportionate attention in Western media compared to the scale and complexity of the country. This critical lens, while necessary in a balanced media ecosystem, often lacks the contextual nuance that is afforded to other nations. As a result, the narrative surrounding India is frequently tilted toward criticism, which contrasts sharply with the tone used when reporting on Pakistan's internal challenges. This disparity in narrative framing can have a significant influence on foreign policy decisions. Policymakers, especially those who rely on public opinion and media briefings, are often shaped by the stories that dominate headlines. If Pakistan is seen as a state in need of support, and India is perceived as a self-sufficient but problematic democracy, the diplomatic tone and aid decisions are likely to reflect that skewed perception. The optics matter. Not just what is reported, but how it is presented, what is omitted, and what kind of language is used. Think tanks, opinion columns, and research publications also play a part in reinforcing these narratives. Many of these institutions are located in the West and are staffed or influenced by experts who may have long-standing institutional relationships with one country more than the other. These relationships can shape how reports are written, how events are analyzed, and how recommendations are made to governments. Pakistan has over decades cultivated relationships with American policymakers, journalists, and researchers, ensuring its voice is heard and its version of events is part of the mainstream discourse. Additionally, Pakistan often leverages crises to shape media coverage in its favor. Whether it's a refugee, emergency, a natural disaster, or a terror attack, the narrative is quickly framed around resilience, cooperation, and the need for support. This creates a cycle in which Pakistan is regularly cast as a nation that is struggling but cooperative, unstable but important. India, meanwhile, often faces coverage that links it to escalation, especially in the context of its tensions with Pakistan. Indian military actions, even in response to provocation, are sometimes portrayed as aggressive or unilateral, reinforcing a perception of imbalance in how both countries are judged. Social media adds another layer of complexity. State-backed narratives, bot campaigns, and selective amplification of certain events can distort global understanding. Pakistan's digital outreach, combined with targeted messaging, helps control the online optics during critical diplomatic moments. India's digital ecosystem is large and active, but often fragmented, with competing voices that dilute a unified national narrative, the result is a digital battlefield where Pakistan sometimes punches above its weight by tightly controlling its message, while India, despite its resources, struggles to maintain consistent image management. In international relations, perception often shapes reality, and media is the lens through which much of that perception is filtered. Controlled optics, intentional messaging, and narrative discipline can significantly influence how nations are treated on the world stage, regardless of their actual power or reliability as allies. Global diplomacy is often less about principles and more about fluid priorities. When analyzing why America appears to favor Pakistan over India in certain geopolitical situations, it becomes clear that shifting interests, rather than static alliances, are driving the equation. Nations, especially global powers like the United States, operate on a dynamic map where allies are chosen and supported not on the basis of long-term loyalty or moral alignment, but on the basis of immediate strategic relevance, evolving threats, and short-term policy goals. In this ever-shifting matrix, Pakistan has historically adapted itself to meet American needs at pivotal moments, whereas India has maintained a more measured, autonomous path. During the Cold War, the U.S. sought dependable partners who could provide strategic military bases and act as buffers against Soviet influence. Pakistan, with its geographical location and readiness to comply with Western interests, quickly filled that role. Over time, it positioned itself as a pivot around which American interests in the Middle East and Central Asia could rotate. While India's democratic credentials and civilizational depth were acknowledged, its non-like stance made it less immediately useful in a world divided into strict ideological camps. When America's core concern was the containment of communism, a compliant Pakistan was a more valuable asset than an independent India. This tendency continued after the Cold War, morphing to fit the new realities of terrorism and regional instability. Post 9/11, America's priorities shifted to defeating the Taliban and rooting out terror networks in Afghanistan and neighboring regions. Again, Pakistan proved useful. The U.S. needed access to supply routes, intelligence cooperation, and regional leverage, and Pakistan offered all of these. It didn't matter that many of the terror networks the U.S. was fighting had deep roots in Pakistani territory. What mattered was that Pakistan was willing to play the role of a counter-terrorism partner. This willingness, even if partially performative, kept the financial and military aid flowing. India, while condemning terrorism and offering rhetorical support, did not allow its foreign policy to be completely subsumed by American objectives. It had its own borders, its own threats, and its own approach to dealing with them. The result was that while India was seen as a long-term partner, it wasn't always the preferred choice in immediate tactical operations. American diplomacy favors agility and utility, and Pakistan repeatedly positioned itself as the country that could serve short-term goals, regardless of long-term contradictions or duplicity. Another reason for America's fluctuating diplomatic stance is the balancing act it tries to maintain between major powers in the region. As U.S.-China tensions increase, Washington aims to avoid pushing Pakistan entirely into Beijing's sphere of influence. Maintaining ties with Pakistan becomes not just a matter of strategic interest in South Asia, but also a tool in the broader global chessboard of U.S.-China competition. Any rupture in relations with Pakistan could accelerate Chinese influence in a region already leaning toward Beijing through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and other Belt and Road initiatives. Supporting Pakistan, at least at a surface level, gives the U.S. leverage it would otherwise lose. Meanwhile, India's rise as an economic and military power has positioned it as a long-term counterweight to China. However, India's refusal to follow Washington's lead in areas such as sanctions, international trade policy, and strategic alignments makes it a more complex partner. While the U.S. values India's potential, it also recognizes that India will not be a predictable ally. This unpredictability, India's insistence on pursuing a multi-uncling foreign policy, forces the U.S. to hedge its bets, keeping Pakistan close enough to be useful, even while deepening strategic partnerships with India. Diplomatic engagement is rarely binary. It's layered, adaptive, and often contradictory. The appearance of favoring Pakistan over India is not necessarily a betrayal of values, but a reflection of Realpolitik. Countries are not chosen as allies based solely on their principles or systems of governance. They are chosen based on timing, relevance, and the ability to fulfill immediate strategic requirements. Pakistan has mastered the art of making itself useful at the right time in the right context. India, on the other hand, has chosen a path of sovereign decision-making that does not always align with America's fluctuating foreign policy objectives